Welcome to Everyday Linux User. In today's video, I'm going to do something slightly different. This is a Linux Q&A. Now, how this is going to work, this isn't a live video, so obviously I can't wait for you to ask questions. But if it is successful, later on down the road, maybe we can do some live sessions and stuff like that. So what I have done this week is fairly simple, and this isn't going to be a great instructional video, but it's going to answer some questions. I've gone onto Quora, Quora.com, and I've searched for Linux, and I've searched for Linux questions in the past week. I haven't gone any further than that. Like if you do past year and beyond, there you get some really old questions that aren't relevant anymore. Now, I'm not going to do every single question on here because some of them are quite technical in nature and would take some research. Some of them are just plain ridiculous. But I'm going to answer the ones I can answer. So let's start off with the first one here. And this is by a guy called Mike Freeman. And it says, why do people use Linux if Linux can't run average user things like Outlook, Photoshop, and Call of Duty? Okay, so let's address that one. So Outlook is an email client, and out of the office, so if you're at home, do you use all the features of Outlook? Do you use Microsoft's Outlook.com email address? Or Office 365 or anything like that? Do you use any of those? If you do, you can use the online version of Office 365, and you can use Outlook there. But there are so many email clients available for Linux, Evolution, Thunderbird, Geary. There are lots of different email clients out there. You don't need to use Outlook. There's a very good alternative to Outlook. And it's not like Outlook is so special that it's got so many features for personal use that you need. At the end of the day, all you need to do is read your emails, maybe look at your calendar, have tasks, etc. And both Thunderbird and Evolution provide that functionality. So that addresses the Outlook thing. Photoshop. Photoshop is a specialist tool for photo editing. Now, let's look at how much Photoshop costs. So here I am on the Adobe website. And you can try it for free, but it's £19.97 per month to run Photoshop if you're a Windows user or a Mac user. Now, how many of those features does the average user use? Now, I'm going to guess that most people don't use Photoshop. Most of the population don't use Photoshop, but the people that do need to use Photoshop, if you definitely need to use Photoshop, then okay, Linux in this case isn't for you. But if you just need some of the features of Photoshop, then there's a tool called GIMP, and there's ImageMagick and things like that. So there is a viable alternative to Photoshop. It's a different workflow, and I'm not going to pretend that I am a Photoshop expert in any way whatsoever, but there are alternatives to Photoshop. So if you want to spend £19.97 a month on Photoshop and you need Photoshop and you need Windows, I'm not suggesting that everyone should use Linux. Everyone should make the choice that is suitable for them. But why do people use Linux if they can't run average things like Outlook and Photoshop? Because people don't need to always use Outlook. They don't need to use Photoshop. And Call of Duty. So let's talk about Call of Duty. It's a game. You can actually run quite a lot of games now on Linux. I'm not sure if Call of Duty is one of them. But also, in order to run Call of Duty on a PC, you need a gaming PC. So gaming PCs are usually quite expensive, usually quite high end. You're not going to run Call of Duty on your average £400 laptop from Argos. It's going to have to be a more expensive PC than that. So most people who run gaming machines, they do use Windows for gaming at this moment in time. That's not to say it's always going to be the case, but chances are at this moment in time that is the case. Or they use a console such as an Xbox or a PlayStation for playing games. That's just the way it is. That doesn't mean you can't use Linux. I have a PlayStation, I have an Xbox. I'm not a big Call of Duty fan because I'm colorblind and I find it difficult to see some of the colors on Call of Duty. But Photoshop, but I use game consoles for playing games. I use Linux for all my desktop PC stuff. So the reason people use Linux if they don't have Outlook, Photoshop, Call of Duty is the answer is simple. They don't necessarily need those applications, and there are viable alternatives available. That's the answer to that question. The next question, is Linux free, and why is Linux better than Windows? So two questions in one there. Is Linux free? It's free to download from various different companies' websites. So Ubuntu and Pop! OS, MX Linux. It is free to download and it's free to install and it's free at the point of use. There are some distributions that charge. Zorin, I believe, is one of them. Elementary is another, but then they're not strict with it. It's more of a donation type thing, and I think Ubuntu's got a donation thing as well if you want to donate. But generally, you can install and use Linux for free. But is it free? Everyone that uses Linux is a contributor to Linux in one way or another. You're either somebody who develops Linux, you're somebody who's using Linux, therefore you're helping the Linux ecosystem because every time you raise a bug report, every time you add to the user statistics for a distribution, you are contributing to that Linux distribution, and you're contributing time, and time isn't free. Your time is worth something. So yes, it's free from a monetary point of view, but from a time point of view, it's not free. But it is worth it. It's no Windows users ever gets excited about using Windows. They don't use it and think, "Oh, I'm using Windows, aren't I great?" You don't have the "I use Windows," by the way. No one's excited by that at all. But Linux users are genuinely excited about using Linux, and they're genuinely enthusiastic about using Linux. Once you get into it, you get hooked, and it's sort of there is a sort of addictive thing about it. You feel good when you're using it, and you do feel like your workflow's better, and you also feel part of a community as well. So why is Linux better than Windows? Subjective. Some Windows users say it's not better than Windows. You get this, you get that. Now, one thing I would say is I can update my Linux system without rebooting my computer and having to sit there for hours on end. And I'll be honest, the last time I updated Windows, it got me into a boot loop where it would keep booting into Windows and say I need to restart, boot, restart, boot, restart. So that's never happened on Linux. Is Linux better than Windows? In my opinion, yes, because I've been a long time user of Linux, but again, it's subjective. Is Linux openSUSE distro a good alternative when you switch from CentOS? I think if you're a CentOS user and you've been a CentOS user for any period of time, then I don't think you're going to have too much trouble if you move to openSUSE. I don't think openSUSE is good for your average person. I don't think your everyday Linux user. I think there's better alternatives. Ubuntu is actually a better alternative to openSUSE. But I would recommend Mint, Pop! OS, and things like that. But I understand why people would use openSUSE, Fedora, CentOS, etc. Is openSUSE a good alternative? If you've got the level of ability to use CentOS and you've been using it a while, then openSUSE will work for you. I just found that hardware setup was a bit hit and miss. Installing an application was a bit hit and miss. It's not as straightforward as using some of the other distributions. But if you're experienced enough to use CentOS, then you're probably experienced enough to use openSUSE and get around the problems that are there. What are the main differences between Windows, Mac OS, and Linux? Okay, so Windows is a closed source operating system, which means Microsoft write all the software, write all the operating system. There's no one can you can't reproduce Windows, although the React OS team would say otherwise. You can't reproduce Windows and sell it on like you can Linux. So there's hundreds of Linux distributions for a start. So you can get the source code, you can compile it, you can build it any way you want to in Linux. In Windows, it's Microsoft produce it, it's their product, the end. Other differences. So Windows has one sort of desktop. It's customizable to a point. Linux has a whole host of different desktop environments and ways of customizing your desktop experience. Windows has awful updates. Linux has great updates. Mac OS I don't know a huge amount about. I have used it on my son's computer, and it's not for me. I find the whole navigating a web page with the way the mouse doesn't work quite as well as it does. Well, it's a different workflow to how it works for Linux. I haven't used it enough to give it a good answer for it. But again, it's closed source and it's for Apple devices, and I'm not willing to pay the premium for an Apple device just to get that. There are certain people that use Apple devices, and some people use it for their work, and some people use it because of the status of using Apple, I feel. And that's my answer to that question. Is it really that someone who is really geeky in computers doesn't need a desktop environment in their Linux installation? You could. If you're an experienced Linux user, you could work without a desktop environment. You can work in the terminal, and you can run graphical applications if you without installing a desktop environment. You can use a window manager and not. A desktop environment is built up of many different things, like a display manager, window manager, panels, menu systems, things like that. So you don't need a fully fledged desktop environment. You can get away with a window manager and panels if you want to. But if you really want to work from the terminal, you probably can. But the question is, why would you? Other than it's called running headless. It depends what you're using that machine for. If it's for running applications, server-side applications and stuff like that, then yes, you can run without a desktop. But to use as a desktop PC, you wouldn't do that. Why do cars have indicators when you can just shove your arms out the window? Because it's just easier clicking the thing and the indicator working, without doing these hand signals, etc. So yes, you could, but why would you? Are there any reasons not to switch from Windows to Linux full time? Probably covered that a bit early on. If you have specific software that you absolutely 100% need to use, that you can't get away from, then you're going to have to stick with Windows. But there's nothing stopping you using Windows as a virtual PC on top of Linux, or indeed Linux as a virtual PC on top of Windows. You can also dual boot. I'm not a huge fan of dual booting. There are guides on my platform for showing how to dual boot, but if you've got a powerful enough machine, I'd rather use a virtual machine than dual booting. What are the benefits of learning Linux for a career as a computer technician? So I've been a software developer since 1995 professionally. And for a lot of that time, I've been developing for Windows. So I started out writing Windows applications. I've written some Unix applications as well, and even for some mainframes. Recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, there is a lot more because of Azure and because of Ubuntu. There is a little bit more, and Docker and Kubernetes, there is a little bit more Linux coming into the workflow, even for somebody who's been using Windows as a programming environment for a long time. So even if you don't plan on using Linux full time, because there are plenty of jobs web development jobs that don't require Linux. I found there is a bit more Linux coming into things, and when it comes to doing things like there's something called Hangfire, which you may or may not be aware of. It's a scheduling tool, and it schedules using something called cron. And now cron's quite anyone who's used Linux for a while will know all about cron. If you use Windows, you might not know about it, but using things like Hangfire, you end up using. There's lots of terminology coming into Windows development and general development that's come from a Linux background. So if you're going into a Linux career full stop, like as sysadmin, then obviously you need to learn Linux. But if you want to be a Windows developer, I'd say there's some kudos in learning Linux as well. You don't have to be an expert. It's just understanding basic commands. And there's tutorials on this platform in my YouTube platform for learning basic Linux commands. How hard is it to learn how to use Linux? Is it worth the time, effort compared to Windows and Mac OS? Honestly, if you follow my videos for installing Pop OS or Linux Mint, MX Linux, Manjaro, the learning curve isn't actually that high for those. Pop OS, you're going to be up and running in no time. Your motivation has got to be key to this. Is what's your motivation to come to Linux? If you think you're going to install Linux and run Windows programs, then that's not going to happen. Whilst there is wine and things like that, your mindset has to change a little bit. You're just going to use applications that work on Linux is the key here. It's not that hard to learn Linux. It depends how far you want to go with it. Obviously, if you want to be a system administrator for a large organization, then you're going to have to learn a lot more, and it's worth investing in training and stuff like that for if you want to become one of those roles. But if you want to use it for desktop use on your own PC, it's definitely worth it because it means, one, you never have to pay for an operating system again, in terms of money, not necessarily in terms of time, but you get around the whole Windows update debacle, and there's a sense of community with Linux. It's just you feel better for using it. Honestly, you do. Can Microsoft use AI to refactor Windows kernel to defeat the Linux kernel in the near years? AI is absolutely everywhere at the minute, and there's lots of scare stories on the news channels and stuff like that. I always worry when I hear politicians talking about anything technical because quite often many of them don't even know how to use a calculator. If the world's finances are anything to go by, that's clearly the case. AI, as I've mentioned, I'm a software developer, and I'm using a trial at the moment for Git Copilot. Git Copilot adds AI to your development environment. And before Git Copilot, there was something called ReSharper, and it would give you code hints, and it would allow you to refactor your code at a click of a button. Git Copilot goes a stage further than this. Actually, you can put a comment in, and it will write the code based on the comment that you've put in. Now, a lot of developers are probably worried that, oh no, our job's going to be out the window. But at the end of the day, it's about users are very bad at coming up with requirements, and they don't know how to articulate them. So I don't think AI is ever going to replace a developer because they don't have the development mindset in terms of what questions to ask. For Microsoft to refactor Windows using AI, well, they could. It's long due a rewrite, I would imagine. I can imagine there's a lot of duff code within Windows, and they could probably do with starting from a clean slate. Defeat Linux kernel, probably not in the next few years. Who knows where AI is going and what's going to happen? I don't think Linux will be defeated. It's just, we just don't know what AI is going to do in the future. There's got a lot of good use cases. I'm not scaremonger when it comes to AI. I'm quite happy with using it alongside my current workflow. It's definitely helping development wise. It's saving time, so I'm not knocking it at the minute. What's the best API for developing a custom lightweight Linux GUI? If you use Python, then there's something called PySimple GUI. You can use Electron on top of JavaScript, so on Node to create JavaScript desktops. There's various. It depends on which programming language you use, how you develop the GUIs. There's PyGTK, PyQt as well. What are some reasons to use Linux over Windows as a desktop? I think we've covered this really. I'm not going to go further on this. On older PCs and lower spec PCs, it could be faster. Updates, the way updates work, are better. And there's a sense of community. You can customize your workflow a lot easier with Linux. It's just more fun. So what is swap space and why does the Linux system use so much of it even though there's enough RAM available? So swap space is, so if you imagine you've got 4 gigabytes of RAM and you allow another 4 gigabytes of swap space. So swap space is a bit of area on your disk that you're going to use as memory. So say you've got 4 gigabytes of actual memory. When a program becomes idle and your system needs more memory for an active application, it can move the idle application into your swap space. And that way it's still, if you need to access that application again, it will copy it from the swap space back into actual memory and move something from actual memory back into the swap space. If you're using a lot of swap space all the time, that means that you're overusing your memory, and you probably need a higher spec PC. Quite often on modern computers, you're doing something intensive on the computer, like such as video editing or games or graphics or something like that. If you're continuously using swap space, modern PCs, you don't necessarily need that much swap space. The answer here is actually quite a good one. Maybe you need to change your swappiness value, and that's basically how much it swaps between actual RAM and your swap space. What are the benefits of building an operating system from scratch instead of existing ones like Linux, Windows? Not specifically a Linux question, that one. Okay, so there is a system that you can use called Linux from scratch, where you can compile and build Linux from absolutely nothing. Now, the only benefits I see of doing that are educational purposes, so that you learn how things are built and how they work. Realistically, if you're one person and you're building your own Linux distro, how are you going to be sure that what you're creating is better than something dozens of other people or hundreds of other people have created? You can imagine how many developers there are for Ubuntu, for openSUSE, Fedora, etc. What makes you think that you on your own can cover all the security flaws, all the optimizations, all the other things that you need to create an operating system from scratch? The benefit of collaboration suggests that working with other people and creating an operating system is going to be better than working on your own. So the only benefit I can see is educational value. It'll teach you how to do certain things that you didn't know before. Is an interesting one. Is it possible to have Windows and Linux installed on the same partition without deleting either of them? Ubuntu used to have this thing where you could install Ubuntu as part of Windows, and so you used to be able to reboot and it would go into the Ubuntu operating system, and that was installed sort of like as part of Windows, almost like an application. Nowadays, you've got Windows Subsystem for Linux. That means you've got Linux installed alongside Windows. I've got a video for that. I didn't find it's okay for running. It's more for software development purposes than it is for running your desktop environment and stuff like that. Uh, it's very it's very hit and miss when you do it like that. You're actually better using a virtual machine if you've got enough power in your machine than having them sitting on the same partition. Obviously, the virtual machine might be stored on the same partition as the Windows. So I guess that answers the question. uh, Next question along is, what are the benefits of using Windows Subsystem for Linux over a normal Ubuntu machine? If you need command line tools for Ubuntu, or you prefer managing directories using Linux notation than PowerShell or Windows command line, then WSL works. I worry to a certain degree with WSL if people start trying to install desktop environments and they start trying to use. I get the feeling that people will end up destroying and deleting files that they didn't mean to delete using WSL. It's a tool for developers and it's a tool for administrators. I don't think WSL's a way of reasonably running Ubuntu or any other Linux operating system within Windows properly. I think basically you're running neither one thing or the other if you do it like that. I don't think it's a good option. Is it possible for a person who has no experience in programming to learn how to code on a Linux machine, Windows computer, or Mac OS computer? When I started, I was bought a Sinclair Spectrum 128K computer back in the 1980s for my parents, and I think I was 11, and I had no programming experience whatsoever. And in the space of a couple of years, I taught myself basic programming and a bit of assembly language. I did go to college, so I learned how to program there. I learned C++ and I learned COBOL, and I learned database like SQL. But I would say things now are so much better than they used to be. When I first started in an office, you'd have all these filing cabinets. I remember working for IBM, and there was all these filing cabinets, and in these filing cabinets were manuals, dozens and dozens of manuals, how to program certain things. So if you had a problem, you didn't have Google, you didn't have Stack Overflow, you didn't have all these resources to help you to program. You would have to find the relevant book. You'd have to open the book, you'd have to look at the index, look at the contents of the book, and you'd have to find the page, and then you'd have to understand that book. And if you didn't understand and there was no one else to help you, you were really stuck between a rock and a hard place. Nowadays, you have so many resources to learn how to do things. There is, for instance, this free code camp which will teach you how to do various things. There's YouTube. If you want to do web programming, there's great videos by a guy called Mosh Hamadami on both YouTube. There's also Udemy if you're willing to pay like £10 for a set of videos. They're usually quite good. And then you got Pluralsight, not free, but it provides good videos for training. But there's so many resources on the internet. You could easily learn how to program Linux, Windows, or Mac OS, etc. So yeah, it's definitely possible. What are the benefits and drawbacks of installing Linux alongside Windows on the same computer? Are there any risks involved in doing this? Okay, so this is dual booting. And so it depends. What's your motivations for running alongside each other? If you just want to try Linux out, if you want to try Linux alongside Windows, then I would recommend a virtual machine, as long as you've got enough memory and resources to run a virtual machine. If you're running Linux alongside Windows because you need a specific Windows application that's not available for Linux, and this is likely to be a long-term thing, then you can run Linux alongside Windows, and that's a good reason for doing so. But again, you could have Linux as the sole operating system and Windows as the virtual machine. Again, it comes down to resources. Um, so the the risks and drawbacks of virtual machines. If you get to a point where you don't need Windows anymore and you've got Windows first and Linux second on the PC, then so you've got Windows first and you've got Linux as a second thing on the partition. So Windows, you decide you want to get rid of Windows. Now, really, to claim that space back that Windows has, you're really going to need to reinstall Linux to cover the whole drive. It's hard to move the partitions around and get it to use the whole disk other than reinstalling the Linux. So that's something you might end up having to do if you decide that you don't need the Windows anymore. It's better if you can install Windows and Linux on different drives altogether. So both, you might have a machine with 2 drives in it. You've got Windows on one drive, Linux on another. That's the safest way to dual boot. Other things that could go wrong, Windows updates can be problematic. So like I said earlier, you can get into a Windows update loop and then you have to reinstall Windows. That could be a Windows issue altogether anyway, but it's trickier to install Windows when there's already another thing on the partition, because Windows doesn't like to play with other operating systems. So it might end up trying to install across the whole drive where you've got Linux on it. Another drawback, of course, is that so you've got say you got a 1 terabyte hard drive and you've allowed 500 gigabytes for Windows, 500 gigabytes for Linux. That's your split down the middle. So you find that you're using Windows more than Linux. So you're using Linux once a month, say. You've got 500 gigabytes that can't be used or isn't being used optimally. Equally, if you're using Linux more than Windows, you've got a lot of disk space for Windows that's taken up. Or imagine you're running out of disk space on the Windows side, so you need more disk space. It's then trickier to move Linux along so you get more disk space. So again, if you're going to run dual boot, it's better if you've got multiple drives, but you can run it all on one drive. But yeah, I prefer virtual machines over dual booting. And my method for doing that, by the way, is to install a very lightweight Linux distribution as the host machine. And then you can have a Windows virtual machine. You can have Linux virtual machines over the top. So the lightweight host means you've got more memory and resource to give over to the virtual machines. It's how I tend to work. Why do people use Linux when it's filled with viruses, since it's so easy to hack? I can walk up to any computer, open the command prompt, and run commands. Oh, wow. I've never had a virus on a Linux computer. I've never been hacked on a Linux computer. If you can walk up to any computer and open the command prompt, that means somebody's left their account logged in. And if you can run commands, that means you know their password or you've been given enough permissions to run the commands. Linux is not intrinsically, Linux is about as secure as it comes when it comes to operating system. The most insecure part of any computer system is the people that are using it. The biggest problem for companies nowadays is people, and it's people clicking email links, and scammers are very clever. We've all seen the emails pretend to be Nigerian princes, etc., and they're fairly easy to spot. But some of the phishing attempts that you get at in companies are quite convincing, and it's easy to see how people are fooled into clicking a link or into downloading something, installing something, running a command, etc. So the biggest flaw with any computer system is the people that are using it. Is it possible to have multiple copies of one operating system on one device? For example, can you have both Windows and Linux installed on the same computer? How would you do it? Is it even necessary or advisable? I've got dual boot guides on my channel. I've covered this already. I prefer virtual machines to dual booting, but you can do it. What are the risks of having multiple Linux distributions installed on the same system? This goes back to the dual booting question again. Dual booting, I think, is problematic whether it's Windows and Linux or Linux and Linux. You're giving up disk space for two operating systems. So if one's running out of space and it's all on one drive, so you've got two distributions on one drive. If one's running out of space, the other one's taken up, not using any of its space, but it's blocked off in a certain part of the partition. You then got a problem resizing the first distribution. Where possible, as I said before, I would use a virtual machine over dual booting. It doesn't matter if it's Linux or whether it's Windows or Linux. I would recommend virtual machines over dual booting. The only time that doesn't come into play is if you don't have enough resources to run one system on top of the other. If you're going to dual boot, have multiple drives in your computer. Only dual boot on the same drive if it's the last resort. Okay, so here's a good technical one. Why do we have multiple ways, well, two ways of going to the same destination? Like in Linux, we have absolute and relative paths, and I'm totally confused. Where do I need to use relative and absolute path? It's just for navigation purposes. I've got a video showing how you navigate around a folder. Okay, so here's a terminal. And if I do pwd, it shows me where I am, home gallery. And if I go into my documents folder, you can see I've got that. I can go into timesheets, and I've got that file there. And that's a folder as well, July 2023. Okay, say I want to go to my home folder, I can do cd home gallery, and that takes me home. Okay, I could equally say cd tilde, that takes me home. I could go back into my documents folder and I could do cd ... And in all those ways are perfectly viable, and the only reason you're using absolute or relative paths are for ease of use. The only time that's different is if you've got an application and the application needs to read a path. You might need to give the full path to an application for it to be able to navigate to it. It might not have the ability to use relative paths, but generally it's ease of use for yourself. There's no reason you have to use one or the other that I can think of. I think that's a good time to stop. If you like this, give it a thumbs up, leave some comments, see if you want more Q&A sessions. I'm going to judge to see whether this is something I can do on a semi-regular basis. But that's the end of the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. And I'll see you next time on Everyday Linux User.